Greetings, Eric here again. So now we're going to get into the other prong of our archaeology series, really dealing with extra-biblical texts as a cross-reference. So these are things that are outside the Bible that are corroborating things in it. And it's a very interesting realm of study. So I wanted to start with particular event that is very meaningful to the history in the Bible. So this is actually taken from the Creation Ministries video. You can see their channel, CMI Creation Station, the YouTube video called Tracing the Nations Back to Babel. Excuse me. So to get to it, I also want to announce this, pretty much everything I'm quoting. I'm not really, this is mostly not my own words, kind of the same with everything else. I add a sentence here and there, but I mostly observe what's prior been discovered and just try to bring it to light of the average citizen. So really, so quoting here, the Hebrew Bible speaks of a global flood being sent by God to punish the whole earth prior to the formations of the nations, afterward from the descendants of the survivors of the flood. This global flood can be and has been calculated to about circa 2350 BC, Bishop Ussher's calculation. Since according to the Hebrew Bible, the nations all start after the time of that flood, there should logically be some secular historical evidence towards the account in terms of dating the Bible's account. In terms of dating if the Bible's account is accurate. So that's a big if. If the Bible's account is accurate, we should find something corroborating this. So we ask, are there any secular records that corroborate or confirm that time scale? And the answer is yes. There are lots of secular records supporting biblical chronology. So first we've got to get some rough background on the Tower of Babel event, what it represents in the Bible. First, we must note that the key event of all of this is the establishment of the Tower of Babel and the divisions of the languages of the peoples from one language into many by God. The Bible gives a timeline for this event internally. So let's just sort of read a small bit of what it's talking about. This is really Genesis chapter 11. So for some background, God sends the global flood as a judgment in the days of Noah. Noah and his family alone are brought onto an ark, along with the various animals which were to repopulate the animals of the earth, of those which could not survive in the seawater. And they're brought on the ark, and God sends the flood. The ark is bearing the survivors, and when the flood finally ends, this flood that was covering the whole globe, as described in the Bible, covering the mountains, the floodwaters recede, and Noah comes out of the ark in the appropriate time, first knowing that it receded by sending out a dove. Dove comes back and then sends out again. Eventually he could tell through the dove that the waters receded enough to be safe to come off the ark, and he came off the ark, which had descended in the region of Ararat, which is likely ancient Urartu. So after this, so Noah comes off with his sons and their families who got on with him, and they start to obviously form their own tribes, their own families, and repopulate the earth. And as the repopulation continues more and more, you have the development of a nation, as it were. And Genesis 11 reads, and all the earth had one language and one speech. So at this time there's no other languages, it's just one language. And it came to be, as they set out from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. So some say, so again, a lot of scholarship for this to be interchangeable with ancient Sumer. And they said to each other, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city whose tower and a tower whose top is in the heavens, and make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered all over the earth. So for the background, God commanded them to be fruitful, multiply, and to spread out all over the earth. But instead of spreading, they're gathering. They're not moving out. They're moving into one locale. They're not doing what God said. Then God came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And Jehovah said, "Look, they are one people, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. And now they are not going to be withheld from doing whatever they plan to do. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so that they do not understand one another's speech." And Jehovah scattered them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. That is why its name was called Babel, because Babel really meaning confusion, because there Jehovah confused the language of all the earth. And from there Jehovah scattered them over the face of all the earth. So he commanded them to scatter, they wouldn't do it, so he forces them to do it against their will by dividing their languages. So I get a picture as you have this united group of people, and they're all working on this massive tower building project, and suddenly, so picture that you're up many, many stories. These ancient Babylonian towers, pretty much most likely a ziggurat, they could go pretty high, and you're up there. Maybe you have some kind of a device with ropes, a puller, and sort of a pulley system bringing up these big stones, and you're talking to your fellow comrade who's helping you build the tower. Hey, how many more stones? And you're communicating, and all of a sudden he's talking all of a sudden you have a language barrier appears out of nowhere. All of a sudden, one moment you're hearing him like I'm talking in English. Let's just give you a theoretical situation. Now, they probably would have had very different names. They wouldn't have had English names. But let's just say, me, Eric, I'm working together with David on the Tower of Babylon. David, can bring up that 4,300-pound stone. Work together with Zechariah and this guy, and then they start bringing up this, and all of a sudden he starts talking me in like another language. All of a sudden I'm hearing like all these Hebrew words or something like Shemini, and I'm like, what? I'm like, all of a sudden, in an instant, without warning, I can't understand anything my friend that I've lived with in the same land, shared the same language all these days, all of a sudden he's talking a different language, and I'm talking a different language, and we're looking at each other with this expectation like, what are you doing? Stop, what is this thing you're saying? And I'm talking to him in my own language, and he's getting more irate and confused because I'm thinking he's understanding me, and then he's looking with a total perplexity, and also we're probably going to end up fighting each other. We're going to end up yelling at each other, and it's like total chaos. That's what's going to happen in the Tower of Babylon if you suddenly spawn languages out of nowhere, out of thin air. Sorry to get kind of excited here, but I kind of want you to really picture what this would have meant. This building project's done. There's no finishing the Tower of Babylon. Nobody can speak the same language anymore. So this makes sense. This would definitely stop the tower project. So again, verse 9, that is why it's called Babel, because there Jehovah confused the language, and from there he scattered them over the face of the earth. And now it mentions a genealogy. Shem brought forth Arpachshad brings forth Shelah brings forth, Shelah brings forth Eber, and they bring forth Peleg. And it mentions that in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. What it's really saying is, in the days of Peleg, that's when this division of languages, this confusion was unleashed on men, against their will and against their plans. So I wanted to give you some background what event we're talking with in the Bible. So first we must note that the key event in all this is the establishment of the Tower of Babel and the division of the languages of the peoples from one language into many others by God. The Bible gives a timeline for this event. In Genesis 10:25 it reads, "To Eber were born 2 sons. And the name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. So again, all of these characters mentioned in a genealogical sequence, and various genealogies are mentioned with birth dates, and you can calculate the date of that these people would have lived approximately. So please note that some have posited an interpretation that speaks of a division of a united continent into the east and west continents. This is not supported in the Bible. For one thing, such an event would have been horrifically catastrophic and logically written of in the Bible. So some people are saying, they are looking at this verse in 10:25, to Eber were born two sons, the name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and they're taking it hyper literally, saying the earth was divided. You have a breakup of continents. This would have been horrifically catastrophic and logically written of in the Bible in greater detail by survivors, but there's no such record. Secondly, the Hebrew word earth or eretz can have different meanings. The traditional interpretation is that this refers to the breakup of the earth by the language division event of God confusing the language. Since that's a context of the passage, really, the event it's tied to in the approximate passages, since they were intent on disobeying the command of God to spread out over the earth, this interpretation is consistent with other passages and their usage of this term. For example, in Genesis 11:1 reads, "Now the whole earth had one language." Now obviously saying the whole earth had one language, it's not saying the ground and the mountains had one language and they talked to mankind. It's saying that the people of the earth were one people, united people, they had one language. Genesis 11:9 saying, "Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth," not of the mountains or the physical earth. So that's when the Bible speaks of division on the earth in the days of Peleg. It really speaks the people's language being divided in the Tower of Babel and their consequential dispersion. So according to biblical chronology, as deducted by Archbishop Usher, the flood occurred 2349 or 2348 BC, and Peleg was born in 2247 BC, about 100 years later. If true, then, we should see the beginnings of the ancient world kingdoms reported around the times following immediately after 2247 BC. With Babylon itself being established in those days. In other words, Tower of Babel, you go to the timeline for that event, people now have new languages. They had one language before, but now they're divided. New languages spontaneously appear, and these people are divided into groups. Not sure what basis this would have been divided on. In other words, what determined who got what tongue, what language, I don't know, but all of a sudden you have a grouping of people. So one group is going to go this way, another group's going to go that way. They're going to disperse and start forming kingdoms, is the logical prediction. If this event happened, that's what's natural. They're going to start forming their own separate rulerships and governing themselves. And they're going to form very quickly kingdoms with military power and with armed fortresses, because logically, if before you could talk the same language and you could know what was going on, and now you have all these people and you can't even understand any bit of what they say, it's going to be very hard to trust them. And distrust, it's going to be hard to even, at this point you didn't even have translators. The study of translation didn't even exist yet. So they're going to separately start forming their kingdoms. So if this is true, we should see the beginnings of ancient world kingdoms reported around the times following this period, 2247 BC, with Babylon itself being established in those days. So the question is, what does secular history have to say? So again, a reminder, this is basically quoting verbatim from the Creation Ministries document. So the founding of Babylon. In 331 BC, after Alexander the Great of Macedon had defeated Darius, it's reported in history that he went to Babylon and there received 1,903 years of astronomical observations, from which the Chaldeans, which they claimed dated back to the founding of Babylon. If this is true, it places the founding of Babylon, by means of that calculation, to 2234 BC, almost 10 years after the birth of Peleg. So remember, Babylon started out of the United Human Kingdom doing a joint urbanization project and a joint temple state project. But now the language groups divide and disperse, and some group, it seems, stayed in that region and in that area and became the Babylonians. So we have the Babylonians being formed officially 10 years about after the birth of Peleg. So this really does fit well. Porphyr, an anti-Christian Greek philosopher. This guy has no theological bias. He doesn't like Christians. Anti-Christian Greek philosopher also deduced about a same number. This man lived in the 3rd century. The founding, because Greeks were very much into scholarship and into history, they just wanted to understand the world that way. Very philosophical and intelligent people. The founding of Egypt. So the Byzantine historian Manassas wrote that the Egyptian estate lasted 1,663 years. If correct, then counting backwards from 526 BC when Egypt was conquered, it gives us the year 2188 BC for the founding of Egypt, about 60 years after the birth of Peleg. Thus Mizraim, the founder of Egypt, and his clan would have moved out and founded the nation of Mizraim, Egypt basically, Mizraim being the name of the ancestor that formed it, at about that time. The founding of Greece. We have records to the founding of Greece as well. According to the 4th century bishop and historian Eusebius, very scholarly man, very meticulous in a lot of what he does, the king of the Greek city of Sicyon, west of Corinth, began his reign 1,313 years before the first Olympiad. Now, the first Olympiad has been dated to 776 BC. Thus, we can calculate that this king started to rule in 2089 BC, about 160 years after the birth of Peleg. So thus we see that secular dating from historians actually supports the biblical accounts and biblical dating of these nations forming after the birth of Peleg, after the days of the flood, after the dispersion of tongues at Babel. This also supports the account of the languages appearing suddenly as recorded in the Bible and not evolving from grunts. In other words, it wasn't some evolutionary process with apes. It's evidence is not pointing that way. It points to something suddenly appearing in humanity's recent history. Hence, the sudden emergence of a plethora of languages in the days of Peleg, around 2247 BC, and the sudden emergence of major kingdoms with separate languages immediately afterward, Egypt at 2188, Greece at 2089, Babylon being the first, also being supported. There's more confirmation. It's just more confirmation that all the nations really did begin after Babel, evidencing the historicity of this event, of the biblical account. And we have more testimony of language history. So, talking about this division of tongues, modern secular linguists are puzzled by the existence of about 20 or 50 language families in the world today. The languages within each family and the people who speak them are shown to be related, but there are few links between the language families, supporting the account that God suddenly created a variety of languages when all prior had one united language. Secular linguists are very challenged by this, since if speech evolved, starting with grunts, etc., moving upward from a common language, as is typically proposed, then there would be genetic links of between all the languages today. The root words would have been traceable back to some sort of primitive proto-language that they all came from in their current forms going backward. But if God really did supernaturally give people different language groups, then of course we would expect the sudden emergence of distinct language groups with little in common and no traceable common origin, which is exactly what we see. So we have biblical landmarking, called what is commonly called the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. We see most of the grandsons of Noah move in the years following Babel. People in various areas called themselves by the name of the man who was their common ancestor. They called their land, often their major city and major river, by his name. Sometimes the various nations fell into ancestor worship, even common to this day in some people groups. When this happened, it was natural for them to name their patron god that they worshipped as a divinity after the name of the man who was their ancestor of all of them who formed their state, or to claim that their long-living ancestor was their god. This means that the evidence is recorded in the way that can be. This means that the evidence is recorded in a way that can never be erased. The names of these different lands, cities, and rivers, etc., we still have records of those names, derivations of those names, and records of those prior names when there was a change in name due to wartime conquering from ancient historians, which the likes of Josephus and various others would record. For example, one example is Mizraim, the Hebrew word for Egypt. At the burial of Jacob, the Canaanites observed the mourning of the Egyptians and called the place Abel Mizraim in Genesis 50:11. Another is Canaan, named after the ancient man Canaan, ancient Israel, which is today called Palestine by many. It also was named after Canaan, from whom the Canaanites were descended from. Also, there is Sidon, who came from the line of Canaan and founded the city of Sidon, which still bears that name to this very day. Sometimes a nation or region is a variation on one of the names of Noah's sons. For example, Heth, one of the sons of Canaan, a grandson of Noah, became the founding patriarch of the Hittites, which linguists do trace back to him. Meshech is the very ancient name for Moscow, and to this very day, one of the areas in the lowland there still carries the name of Meshech. Oftentimes, translation changes and the name, but the rule still in general applies. For example, Ashkenaz, the son of Gomer, one of the Noah's grandsons, his name is translated into German as Germany. There are far more examples, especially in the case of, well, not really Germany, Deutschland, basically. There are far more examples, especially in the case of the name changes following the Hellenization of the various regions of the Middle East. Josephus, the Jewish historian, does note many of these changes in one of his works from the 1st century historian, and you can see more on this article by Creation Ministries at creation.com/grandsons. Another interesting evidence to the biblical history claims comes from characters in Chinese writing. If we look, for example, in the flood account, you can see examples of this in a book that's been written called Oracle Bones Speak, taken from the Discovery of Genesis, C.H. King, Ethel R. Nelson, page 55. For the case of the Noahic flood account, the Chinese ancient word for boat is a composite word consisting of vessel, 8, and people. So it kind of looks like this. I wrote a copy of it in Chinese. Boat, vessel, 8 people, and they become this composite word for boat. So just showing you from my notes there. So in Genesis 6:9, the flood account tells us that 8 people survived the flood on a boat. Another example of the word is the word to covet or to desire in Chinese. This ancient Chinese dialect, when written, it comes in the form of 2 trees and woman to form the composite. So you can see what that looks like here, kind of my writing, 2 trees, ancient Chinese, woman, and then it forms the composite word here for to covet. Very fascinating. Because what's that remind you of? It really harkens back to the account in Genesis of the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and Eve, the wife of Adam, eating the forbidden fruit which she coveted. And we look at ancient Chinese language and we find evidence of this historical happening. Genesis says that Eve saw that fruit of the forbidden tree was pleasing to the eyes and seemed good to her for food. So really she coveted it. The word forbidden or to warn is also similar. Forbidden or to warn. Just to take the previous word and switch the word for woman with the word for God, it is abbreviated in the form forbidden. Sorry, I kind of messed that up. The other one, sorry, this one here is for forbidden. But yeah, very interesting. Not the same there. Sorry, I got confused. But that one's for to warn or forbidden, and it has the same thing. 2 trees, but then God in abbreviated form. So God and 2 trees, and that becomes the Chinese composite word for forbidden in the ancient Chinese language in its written format. Well, that's fascinating because God forbid the eating from the one tree, right? So the word forbidden or to warn is also similar. So again, the one for coveting is 2 trees plus woman. It looks like this. Very fascinating. But this one is forbidden. 2 trees and then the abbreviated form of God. You can see that. So there's another reference to Genesis 2 when God forbid the eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You can see more of this at creation.com/characters. So another point that they cross-reference. Now this is getting outside cross-referencing ancient stuff, but this is actually kind of cool. So I should put this is more of a scientific observation, probably belong in the scientific category, but it's related. The population of the Earth fits with this report also. To get from 8 people to 7 billion requires a growth rate of about less than 0.5% per year to fit within the time span given those 8 flood survivors till now. While currently the growth rate of the Earth's population greatly surpasses that, ringing in at 1.1% per year. This means that for every 100 million people, 1.1 million are added every year. Thus, mathematically speaking, to the Earth's population can easily grow from 8 to the current number in the span of years from the immediate post-flood till now, approximately 4,365 years. You're also considering all the things that brought unexpected deaths and stuff. So, in case because the population would be significantly larger, predictably, there's a lot of things that sort of cut down the human population. But so the numbers really match there too. That's a fascinating finding. That's some things referencing really and corroborating this global flood account. And we know it was a global, not a local flood, because the language reads as a global flood. So I didn't know if I wanted to share this or not. But there's a series on this by Creation Ministries, because that debate came up. So many, so I guess I'll quote from this as well. This global humanity-destroying flood account in the Bible and much of ancient history, the Bible reports of a global flood that covered the whole earth, the whole sphere of the earth even, above the mountains, and destroyed all living things except Noah and his family, and the animals that were brought in the ark. Logically speaking, if this is the case, and the account of this flood is indeed a real story, we should expect to find geological evidence, fossil evidence, and commonality of flood accounts in early human history of such an event. And we absolutely do find evidence of that such. Now, the question is it global Earth sphere covering flood or local Mesopotamian flood of the known world? Some believers in the flood of Noah's time subscribe to a view of a lesser flood, following pressures by various evolutionists and atheists and such. Not getting angry with those people, just making the observation why they mostly do this. Essentially defining terms like earth and world in the Bible in this context to a presupposed notion that all mankind had the same approximate locale, the known world, and typically the Mesopotamian area, so that the flood is then viewed as what we call a local flood, not a global flood. Again, this is often done so that the implications of a global life-destroying flood do not need to be considered in analysis of fossil evidence. namely to the effect of leaving leeway, as it were, for the current fossil record and geological strata, etc., to still have place to be seen as the result of millions to billions of years of gradual development, also called deep time, leveraging an amalgamation of the biblical flood account with the view of life's development by the theory of evolution by the belief set of evolutionists. To accomplish this, the Genesis 7-day account also has to be tampered with, and various other things, sort of explaining the origin of why people proposed that, oh well, a flood really did happen, but it was a local event. Now I'm not going to get too much into the debate, and I'm not going into evolution right now on this. I'm mostly just talking about what does the Bible really say about this flood. Is it a global flood, or is it a local flood only in the region of Mesopotamia? Well, the text of the Bible, when reading according to its own contextual word definitions, implies a global earth sphere covering flood. That is just blatant and obvious. There are numerous evidences of this. One, the need for the ark. So again, this is from Creation Ministries' work, Was Noah's Flood Global? They did most of the research for this. Really, they did all of the research from this. I'm just quoting from them. In the flood of... If the flood was local, there would be no need for an ark to be built. Noah and his family could have simply migrated over the mountain ranges towards lands and would not have been reached, especially since the ancient account mentions a divine warning. In other words, God warning, hey, Noah, a flood is coming to cover the earth. Well, if earth just meant Mesopotamia, you'd just say, just migrate over this mountain range and you'll be fine. Even traveling just 20 kilometers per day, Noah and his family could have traveled over 3,000 kilometers in 6 months. For the second, the size of the ark. If the flood was local, then why was the ark constructed to be of such a great size, able to fit all the vertebrate animals of the world, if only the Mesopotamian animals were aboard, or only domesticated animals of the ark could have been... The ark really, if it was only the domesticated animals, the ark could have been much smaller. So the size of the ark is textual evidence for a global flood as well. Number 3, the need for animals to be on the ark. If the flood of Noah was local, then why did God send animals into the ark to escape death when they could have simply migrated outward? God could have put it into the minds of the animals to migrate too, especially since only a small amount of each type needed to be preserved according to the biblical account. So why would the animals to begin with be confined to only that part of the earth? Wouldn't really make sense. Number 4, the need for birds to be on the ark. The Bible is very clear that of the animals that Noah brought onto the ark, not necessarily the ones that could survive in the sea, he needed to bring birds on the ark. If the flood were local, why would birds have to be sent aboard the ark? Put aboard the ark? They could have just easily flown away to other lands if the flood was local. Again, that doesn't make sense. Birds can fly several hundred kilometers a day, so a local flood is zero threat to them at all. Number 5, the judgment was universal. In the Bible, the text says that the flood was a judgment on all men, not on one race of men. If it was local, then some would have escaped, having already lived in other regions. Moreover, Jesus also states that the flood killed everyone not on the ark in Matthew 24:37-39. Number 6, the flood was a type of the judgment to come, analytically, textually speaking. The coming universal judgment by fire of the Gospels is compared to the previous universal judgment by the water of the flood, as 2 Peter 3:6-7 states. The world that then existed was deluged with water and perished, but by the same word the heavens and the earth that now exist are stored up for fire, being kept until the day of judgment and the destruction of the ungodly. The waters were above the mountains. Genesis 7:20 reads 1.7. It reads in the Genesis count, the waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them to 15 cubits deep. 1 cubit is approximately 18 inches, so 15 cubits is 7 meters or 22.5 feet. And we know that water seeks its own level by nature. So how could water cover the mountains and it not be a global flood, since water seeks its own level? The duration of the flood, number 8, is also another pointer. Noah and his company, according to the narrative, were on the ark for 1 year and 10 days. See Genesis 7:11, 8:13-14, which state, in the 600th year, on the 2nd month, in the 17th day of Noah's life, the flood started, and all the mountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. The flood ended in the 601st year, the 2nd month, on the 27th day of Noah's life, and the earth dried. Thus the flood duration was 1 year and 10 days. That is an excessive amount of time for a local flood, or for any local flood. There would be no way for them to drift around without seeing the tops of mountains. The text says that it took more than 7 months for the tops of the mountains to become visible in this flood. Number 9, from the textual perspective, God's promise would be broken. If the flood of Noah was local, then God, who said he would just not destroy the entirety in that manner ever again, would be lying, since there have been thousands of local floods since the time of the Great Flood. God would be breaking his own promise in these instances he made it. For example, in recent times there have been huge floods in Bangladesh, where 80% of that region was inundated. Also in Europe in 2002 there was massive flooding there also. Point 10, in the biblical text, all the people are descendants of Noah and his family. The genealogies of Adam, Genesis 4:5, and Noah, Genesis 10, are exclusive. They tell us that the pre-flood people came from Adam, and that all the post-flood people came from Noah. The descendants of Noah were all gathering at Babel and refusing to fill the earth, thus being forcibly dispersed by God through the dividing of tongues. Another evidence to this genealogy are the global flood stories found across the world, which we cover in a later section. It is well to note that the locales closest to ancient Babylon have more detailed accounts, and the nearest in detail to the biblical account. Number 11, the Hebrew terminology of Genesis 6-9. The Hebrew word eretz, which is translated earth and used 46 times in the flood account of Genesis 6:9, as well as Genesis 1, and Genesis 11, sort of really using it that way. Eretz refers to an entire earth as seen in Genesis 11. It's typically used more in the sense of the people of the earth too, the entirety of the people. The judgment of God is pronounced in the flood account on all the earth. Genesis 6:13 reads, "And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh." Listen to the language there, all flesh. "For the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth." The phrase "upon the face of the earth" also appears in Genesis 7:3 and 8:9. This phrase clearly connects with Genesis 1:29, which refers to the whole earth as their domain. The same phrase, so "on the face of the earth" appears in Genesis 1:29, referring to the domain of humanity. The same phrase is used again at the dispersal of people at Babel. Again, this context refers to the whole earth in its entirety, the whole globe, and not just a region. The phrase "face of the ground" is also used, which connects with the Genesis account of creation. In Genesis 2:6, where it states, "And a mist was going up from the land and was watering the whole face of the ground." Another phrase in the flood account, "all flesh," is used also 12 times in the flood account, where nowhere else in Genesis God said that he would destroy all flesh, and apart from those in the ark. For example, in Genesis 6:13 and 6:17, it reads, "And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is in the earth shall die." In other words, basically, everything not in the sea is going to die. The phrase "every living thing" is also used. In Genesis 6:19 and 8:17 it reads, "And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you, of all flesh, birds, and of animals, and of creeping creatures that creep on the earth, that they may swarm on the earth, and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." The phrase "under the whole heaven" is also used in the flood account. Genesis 7:19 reading, "And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered." This phrase is used 6 times apart from the flood account: Deuteronomy 2:25, Deuteronomy 4:19, Job 28:24, Job 37:3, Job 41:11, Daniel 9:12, always with a universal meaning. In Job 41:11, "Who has first given to me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine." The phrases "fountains of the deep," "fountains of the great deep" are used. Genesis 7:11, 8:2 reads, "On that day all the fountains of the great deep were burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened." The fountains of the great deep and the windows of the heavens were closed, and the rain from the heavens was restrained in the later parts when the flood was to end. This Hebrew word for deep relates back to creation, to the one ocean covering the whole world before the land was formed, and speaks of something that is global, not local. Thus, from the text, we can clearly see that the flood, if it occurred according to the Bible, was global, not local. The wording clearly reads that way: a massive amount of water covering the whole earth sphere. Point 12, the New Testament speaks of the flood as global. New Testament passages which speak of the flood also in universal language. For example, Matthew 24:39, "The flooding came and took them all away." Luke 17:27, he said the flood came and destroyed them all. 2 Peter 2:5, "Did not spare the ancient world," in Greek cosmos, "but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly." 1 Peter 3:20, "A few, that is 8 people, were saved through the water." 2 Peter 3:6, "The world that then was, being flooded by water, perished." Further possible things to consider. So some are going to say all does not always mean all. This can be true in the biblical text. If we examine the text, we will indeed find a few exceptions. For example, in Luke 2, verse 1, "In those days a decree went forth from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered." Admittedly, in this context, that does not mean all the dominion of the whole sphere of the earth, but the whole of the Roman rule. The weak point to this point being used as an objection is that the whole passage of a text determines its usage even when a word can carry multiple usages or meanings. Most commonly, of the multiple meanings or usages, some will be ruled out as invalid and not the intended meaning when the whole of a passage is examined. This is especially the case in the flood account. Genesis 7:19, "all," in Hebrew kol, "the high mountains were," kol, Hebrew, "of the heavens were covered." And here the double use of "all" gives added intensity and emphasis, and the surrounding text adds further definition to the meaning. 12. The post-flood geography is the same as the pre-flood. In other words, the mention of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers being mentioned before the flood in the account of Garden Eden, and also afterward, yet we have these same rivers now. So some say, well, the global flood would have obviously altered the topography, but it didn't, because we still have the same rivers. This point doesn't work, as there are some major topographical differences described in the Garden of Eden and the world afterward. For example, there was one river flowing from Eden which separated into 4 waters, namely 4 rivers in Genesis 2, 2 of which were called the Tigris and the Euphrates. So these rivers had a common source before the flood. This is very different from today. The other 2 rivers no longer appear in the post-flood. So the evidence of the text is that the topography is different following the flood. Moreover, these modern-day rivers are flowing those carrying the same names, on top of miles of, if the flood happened, what's really flood deposited sediment and rock, so they are not the exact same as the pre-flood rivers described. As for the reason why they have the same names, a good comparison is how the settlers who came to the North America often named the areas they built up the same names, such as Glasgow, Essex, York, etc., of the areas they were previously a part of in Europe. Settlers to the New World brought names of the Old World with them. The same naturally happened in the case of Noah and his sons, who had left the pre-flood Old World for the post-flood New World. Of course, in similar fashion, they brought old names with them to new terrain. And in the same way that both continents bear similarities in some senses, the looks of rivers, lakes, forests, etc., being made up of the same components, albeit different, we should expect that areas of a similar appearance to that of previous order, though the names would be given, though different, they would be given the same names. Thus, recycling occurs with naming. And there is no, so for the other claim that there is no evidence for such a flood in the geological record, that is not at all true. There's geological evidence for a previous catastrophic global Earth sphere covering flood, which we discuss in a later section. That's going to be more for the science debates that we'll get into. We do find evidence of these things. So at any rate, I didn't normally, this was supposed to be more the historical work cross-reference side, but I just decided to stick in the other debates tied to the Noahic flood to sort of conglomerate things, make it easier. So I'll probably change the video title of this video to be something more appropriate to that, but here's the start of our ancient historical cross-references as far as the global flood of Noah in this case. Drawing from some ancient documents, we can see that the dating is consistent. And we have a lot more to verify some other things in the Bible, so we'll get into that in the next video.